Hi, everyone. I am Tia Nelson. I'm the Innovation Programs Manager with South Carolina Department of Commerce. I had the distinct pleasure of talking to Matt Dunbar today with VentureSouth. How are you, Matt?
Doing great. How about you, Tia?
Great. Thank you for making this time for us.
Thanks for
So,
having me.
yeah, definitely. So I'm going to jump straight in and provide a little background info on Matt because he has an important background and it'll also set the stage for this interview. Matt is the founding manager of VentureSouth, along with Charlie Banks. He was also the founding managing director of UCAN. That was VentureSouth's original group in Greenville. We'll talk about a little bit. Matt developed the operations that became VentureSouth, and under his leadership, UCAN was named a top 10 angel group in the U.S. Matt served 2 terms of the board of directors of the Angel Capital Association from 2013 to 2019, and is also a director of Integra Financial Corp. He was previously a management consultant with the Boston Consulting Group and an engineer with Eastman Chemical Company. Matt holds an MBA and a master's in education from Stanford and a BS in chemical engineering from Clemson. So happy to have you, Matt. This is a big topic today. We are talking about funding and investment. So without having to provide much backstory, because that's what this whole interview is about, I'll just kick it off with what is investment in your world? Why do you guys exist?
Great question. So VentureSouth is an early stage investment platform that allows individual investors, who we call angel investors, to invest directly in early stage, high growth potential companies based in the Southeast. So historically, entrepreneurs have a difficult time finding capital to fund their ventures when they're still very young and very risky. They're certainly not bankable in a traditional sense. Oftentimes, entrepreneurs will use their own resources or friends and family to help get off the ground. But then beyond that, particularly in the Southeast, where there's not a robust venture capital market historically, it's difficult for those entrepreneurs to find that risk capital. And so we exist to fill a gap in the capital marketplace, to bring investors together with those entrepreneurs to be able to make a market effectively between those two groups and facilitate that transaction so our investors can support those companies, those entrepreneurs, with early stage equity capital.
Wonderful. So that's a good background and basis for why you guys exist. But I thought it'd be interesting if we could paint a picture of the upstate in South Carolina back in the early UCAN days. I think obviously we're in a historic moment right now, and we're thinking a lot about this economic recovery with COVID. Can you just kind of give us some backstory on what it was like when you first got started?
Yeah, so I came on the scene in early 2008 after some efforts had been underway for some time to form an angel group in Greenville. Part of that was an outgrowth of the formation of SC Launch with some enabling legislation. I think that was 2005, 2006. So Launch was created under SCRA to help provide early stage capital for entrepreneurs in the state. And that led to a new pipeline of opportunities for investors to consider. There was already an angel group in Charleston. There was a group of folks in Greenville that wanted to start an angel group here in the upstate as well. So they started putting plans in place in the 2007 timeframe with a plan to launch in early 2008. I met that group about that time and was in the market to find a new opportunity. I was in Atlanta, wanted to move back to South Carolina. And so it worked out that my timing was right, and they asked me to come on board to be the managing director for, again, what we called UCAN, the Upstate Carolina Angel Network at that time. So we started in April of 2008, which if you recall, the rest of 2008 didn't turn out to be so auspicious from an macroeconomic standpoint. So certainly faced some challenges thinking about how to start early stage investing in the Great Recession. But actually it bought us some time because we didn't already have a portfolio that died as a result of the recession. It bought us some time to figure things out. And I think, again, with the genesis of Launch a few years earlier, folks looking for alternatives to public market investments at that time, as the economy started to recover, that gave us an opportunity to find our way from a process standpoint and start to look at interesting opportunities over the course of 2009, 2010, and then we started growing from there.
Cool. And I mean, there were several events, and the angel tax credit actually just renewed, and I think it's timely, and it's good to have that period as an example for where we're at now, because I was actually on the Small Business Council of the State Chamber as a small business owner myself when we first brought that up as a competitive opportunity for the state. And so I was glad to see that it got renewed. Can we just kind of get some backstory on that credit? A lot of people aren't quite sure why we need a competitive mechanism like the tax credit and what that means for economic impact in the state itself. So just where you're at now with that and where you would like to see it go.
Yeah, we initially started to explore the potential for an angel investor tax credit in 2009. So one of the first things we did when we started UCAN in 2008 was to join the Angel Capital Association, which is a trade group of other angel groups around the country. So we learned a lot very quickly by benchmarking best practices from those groups. And we noticed that about 25 other states had this angel investor tax credit program to try to incent individual investors to take risk, to bet on early stage ventures in their backyard, in their own market. We didn't have that in South Carolina, but North Carolina had it, and Georgia was in the process of putting one in place. And so we felt like that was an opportunity we should explore and pursue. Fortunately, a legislator by the name of Bill Wiley took interest in the effort and championed the bill early on. And in fact, the first angel bill was named after Bill Wiley. He unfortunately passed away during the period of time when we were working on this piece of legislation. But from 2009 to 2013, after 4 years of effort and working with legislators and building our case, it finally was created in 2013. The simple idea is that because these are risky ventures and because we're not historically a strong venture market, we want to give investors an extra incentive or a risk mitigation to entice them to invest in startups in our state. And the reason for that is not really for the benefit of the investors per se. It's really for the benefit of the entrepreneurs and the opportunities they create. So it turns out that all net job growth in the economy comes from young companies that grow fast. And so if we don't have a mechanism to provide capital to those entrepreneurs that can create new technologies and new companies of the future that grow quickly and create new jobs and wealth in our communities, then we're going to continue to struggle to attract and retain entrepreneurs to grow those kind of companies in South Carolina. So the idea is that you leverage capital that's sitting on the sidelines that investors own, that may be in public markets or investing in venture funds in other parts of the country, but not going to work in our own backyard to support entrepreneurs. You give them an incentive or again, a risk mitigation tool to entice them to invest more dollars here in the state. And the way the credit works is if an investor invests in a qualified South Carolina headquartered technology-driven company, then they can receive a 35% credit against that investment amount on their state income taxes. And there's a lot of nuances and some details around the mechanics of how that works, but that's the basic idea. And that number came from benchmarking other states and again, trying to make sure we were competitive with states around us and other states that do this. And so it was passed in 2013. Since that time, over $100 million of qualified investment has been invested into about 300 companies in the state who've created at least 1,200 high-paying jobs. So from our point of view, the credit has been very effective. The credit, when it was originally passed in 2013, included a 6-year sunset. So it expired at the end of 2019. So we've been working for the last couple of years to try to get it extended. And actually, we'd like to amend some elements of the credit. But for now, we were told that the best we could do was hope for an extension. After some, again, effort by a lot of folks to help us make that case, the legislature did approved that extension of the tax credit over the last couple of weeks, and the governor signed it earlier this week. And so we're excited that the credit has been extended for another 6 years, which again, we think is a great tool and opportunity to support entrepreneurs in the state. It's a total pool of $5 million a year of available credits. Last year, that total pool was oversubscribed by more than 2x. So it's clearly working to draw investors in to allocate capital to startups in the state. So we're excited about that, and we want to continue to grow and improve that program and help facilitate more investments in South Carolina startups.
That's wonderful. So it's a good segue into talking about a couple other community development tools that I'm glad to see that we're expanding past just the traditional models for growing our local economy, and we're seeing it as more holistic. I mean, the nonprofits and many other sectors have an important role in building our workforce and all that goes into that. So VentureSouth commonly refers to the flywheel effect when you're talking about economic impact, and you're more specifically talking about your investors and how to educate and equip them. What does that mean? Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's one of my favorite phrases. And I took the phrase from Jim Collins' book, Good to Great. If you've read that or familiar with it, he talks about the flywheel effect, and he's subsequently published a monograph that dives into the flywheel effect more deeply. But the idea is that if you look back at Good to Great, where they compared similar companies, one of which went on to great success over a long period of time, it was a matched pair set, and so the other company would have been similarly situated but not had the great success that the Good to Great company did. One of the things they observed is that these companies would often build that success over time. It wasn't an overnight success, and it wasn't chasing new opportunities at every given turn. They slowly built momentum in this flywheel effect kind of a way, where little wins stacked on top of each other and built momentum. And that's really what we envision that we're trying to do as part of VentureSouth. Is we started with a small group in Greenville. We paired that with this emerging pipeline of companies. And if we can match those investors and those companies, put some dollars to work, ultimately, again, this is a risky asset class, so we know a lot of those investments will fail. But when we have some wins, that creates new momentum. And the way that works is that those wins not only recycle capital to investors that they can then reinvest, it also recycles know-how in our economy. So how do we do this venture thing in South Carolina where we haven't done a lot of it historically? How do investors learn how to make investments? How do entrepreneurs learn how to approach investors and make a compelling case to raise the capital? Then again, those entrepreneurs are taking that capital, that know-how, they're creating jobs, they're creating opportunities, they're attracting talent. That's another part of the flywheel. As those companies build momentum, they draw in more talent into the state, which builds our pool of available capital, human capital, to deploy in not only that company, but new spinoff companies and new opportunities that will emerge as that entrepreneurial mindset grows and people are finding new opportunities. So the idea is that we're building this momentum over time. We put some capital to work, it attracts more talent. That talent is able to go to work, create jobs, create returns for investors when there's a liquidity event for those investors. That capital, that know-how gets recycled into the economy. And so we're building this flywheel over time. That draws in more investors. So we've expanded from that group in Greenville in 2008 to now we're across 14 markets in the Carolinas. When you mentioned Charlie Banks, Paul Clark was also a co-founder with us of VentureSouth, which we really started building out in 2013, 2014. And so now we've got that flywheel turning. So whereas in the early days, we might invest $1 million a year, last year we invested almost $13 million. And so again, just a slow, steady build up of momentum over time that sort of feeds on itself. And that's the flywheel effect. And that's what we're trying to do and accelerate in our markets.
Cool. And I think we'll go a little bit deeper into Venture Carolina and some other things that you guys are doing that's really interesting. But I wanted to switch gears just a little bit and go back to, we have a lot of innovators who pay attention to Scribble and what we're doing through the Office of Innovation. I'm sure you get these questions all the time. So I thought it would be great just to have kind of a quick rapid fire of a couple basic know-how questions when it comes to investment. So if you were to go with your gut response, what's the single most important thing a founder needs to know about the funding process itself? Like when they're trying to think about pursuing investment?
Yeah, another good question. And you mentioned Venture Carolina, so I'll come back to that later. We do a number of workshops for entrepreneurs. One of them is how to pitch. And our premise for that workshop is essentially the answer, if you want to raise capital as a startup, the real fundamental answer is that you need to build a credible case. At the end of the day, that's really all you're trying to do is build a credible case that you and your startup have the potential to be one of those few startups that actually succeeds. Again, the failure rate is high in startups. That's just the nature of the beast. You're trying to do something new and different, and it's really hard. And most of the time, it doesn't work out. And investors know that. And so what you have to do as an entrepreneur is convince the investor that you have a better chance of being one of the winners in that portfolio than the others. And so there's a lot more behind that, but you're really just trying to tell a credible story how the combination of your insight and your technology and your plan and your capital and your team can combine to make the investor believe that this company has a real shot to make it through the valley of death, so to speak, get to the other side, grow, and generate an attractive return on capital for that investor. So to tell a credible story as an entrepreneur, you've really got to do your homework and understand what that investor is going to be looking for. Again, we get into a lot of detail behind that in some of our workshops, but you asked for rapid fire. That wasn't particularly rapid, but I'll stop there and say, tell a credible story is really the single best answer to how an entrepreneur can be successful raising money.
Oh, that's great. And we're going deeper on that subject anyway, so that was a good foundation. Investment is different in terms of the actual type of business and the sector and the entrepreneur. And so I thought it might be a good idea to just give you an opportunity to have a 1 minute, I guess, pitch. Somebody walked up to you in a restaurant and they want to seek investment, and you get, a couple minutes or a minute or a couple seconds to be able to tell them real quick what they need to know. And it's, the most important thing that they need to know. And I'd like to start with traditional tech, because that's what most people think of, but getting into a couple other types of industries that, the investment process is different based on what type of company you have and what your goals are as a founder and entrepreneur. So we'll start with tech. What would your quick response be to them as their go-to advice?
Again, I think I would come back to, can you convince me in a short period of time that you have a compelling new insight to solve a real problem? What is the real problem in the world that you solve uniquely? And can you sell that solution in a way that scales? Meaning, can we generate revenue faster than we have to generate the cost to support that revenue? And software is a great example of businesses that can scale really well because you can make it once and sell it many times, that kind of idea. So the entrepreneur would want to try to convince me in that minute that they had a unique, compelling technological solution to a big problem or a problem that enough people have that they are willing to pay for an answer to the pain of that problem. And you have a solution that will work, and some sense of the business model to suggest that the unit economics make sense and that it can scale.
What about somebody in the service industry? They want to start a service business.
Yeah, so services are tougher because they don't tend to scale quite like a technology company, because typically a service business is people dependent, and your ability to provide that service is based on increasing the supply of people available to provide the service. And so they tend to grow linearly, and there's not that scalability where the revenue outpaces the expenses. So oftentimes we're not investing in service businesses, at least not without a technology component of that. So we're probably not the best fit for a service business, to be quite honest. But there are other financing mechanisms out there. So if you can generate repeatable business, if you can demonstrate long-term contracts and trusted relationships, those tend to be the things I would say that would be most likely to position a service company to be able to raise other forms of capital, whether it's debt or other kinds of financing.
Right. And you guys are usually looking for companies that understand going into it that there's eventually going to be an exit, and there's going to be an opportunity there for everyone to cash in. For the traditional entrepreneur that's thinking about a lifelong business, something they want to hand to family members, what are their options? I mean, what's out there for them?
Yeah, so that's a great point. We do, in fact, need to understand as part of our diligence process what the entrepreneur's thinking is about a liquidity strategy or an exit strategy. we typically invest with a plan to be involved in the business for 3 to 5 years. And then what we would typically expect is that the entrepreneur is going to sell that business to a bigger strategic buyer in that space, or potentially a financial buyer. But we have to be aligned that going in, both the investors and the entrepreneur agree that the objective is to sell this business in 3 to 5 years. That's how we get a return on our equity. So again, we're not debt investors, we're equity investors. So we own a minority piece of the business. And that's the way we're going to make our money, is by selling that to a buyer. So we need alignment with the entrepreneur. If the entrepreneur instead wants to run the business for a career and not sell it, that's probably not a great fit for us, because that's not likely to be able to generate the kind of return we seek in exchange for the risk we're taking. So for those entrepreneurs, there's lots of other resources out there. Again, depending on the type of business, but certainly loan programs through the SBA can be really effective for those types of companies, provided you've got some cash flows that you can demonstrate that can service the debt. There are other financing tools out there, inventory financing. There's some revenue financing vehicles that have become more prominent in recent years. So it's not quite a loan. It's not quite equity. It's effectively a loan, but instead of having a fixed payment every month, it's variable based on the amount of revenue you generate in a given month. So those tools can be effective. There's crowdfunding now, particularly for consumer products. We encourage entrepreneurs to consider a crowdfunding campaign, which would be really a pre-sale of the product, which can be really useful and demonstrate market viability. Equity crowdfunding is another option available to entrepreneurs now after the Jobs Act passed a few years ago, although we caution entrepreneurs to be careful with that, because there's 600 and some odd pages of regulations associated with that, and it can be cumbersome and complex and risky. And if you don't do it right, it can cause problems downstream that basically can allow someone to just say, hey, you need to give me my money back. And that triggers a cascade of everybody else wanting their money back, which can basically sink the company. So you have to be careful with that. But there are a number of those financing options out there that we would encourage entrepreneurs to pursue.
That's great advice. Our last example in this little series. So a manufacturing company, someone that's just starting to get into manufacturing, would you have different advice for them, or what would their 1-minute pitch be to you?
Yeah, so again, for us, we are typically looking for companies that are not capital intensive, because we don't have hundreds of millions of dollars of capital at our disposal. Manufacturing companies we get involved with would be light manufacturing companies. Maybe they're making a device for measuring something, an analytical device, a medical device, those types of companies we do get involved with, because again, there can be some scalability to that. Obviously, you're going to have a cost of goods component of making the hardware, but if you've got a really compelling technology solution, those things can grow and scale quickly and be attractive to strategic buyers. So again, I'd say for those folks, it's really important to understand your unit economics, understand if there might be some opportunities to combine types of finance to lower your cost of capital. So if you can line up some debt financing for producing the hardware, then you might be able to pair that with equity financing that's taking on more the market risk side of it, without the collateral of the hardware, the devices. That can be a compelling strategy and lower your cost of capital as an entrepreneur. So again, I think the premise though would still be the same. Can you convince us that this is a compelling solution to a sizable problem people are willing to pay for? And can you do it at an effective price point where you can cover all of your hard cost and show some increasing margins as you grow the business?
Awesome. So this is a broad question, but what's the most common reason a startup doesn't get funded?
Yeah, so not to be too tongue-in-cheek, but to my prior comment about not being credible, there's something about the story that doesn't add up. Either we're not convinced it's a big enough problem, or we're not convinced that the solution is really compelling. It could be that we're not convinced this team has the right skill set or background to be able to go out and effectively do this hard thing of taking something from 0 to 1, so to speak, and growing it from the ground up. So we see those things across the board. I would say maybe a slightly different take on that question is the failure modes that we see for most companies is one of two things. Either they just can't find enough customers and they think they've got a great solution, but maybe the market's just not as big as they thought, or maybe it moved on them in the process of developing their technology, something better came along, or they just didn't understand the customer need as well as they thought they did. They don't have a compelling enough solution for people to buy. So lack of customers is the primary failure mode. And then the other one I would say is team issues. So if the team blows up or has conflict, or there's a loss of confidence in the CEO, that's probably the second largest failure mode that we see. And so we're really looking for those things when we do diligence on a company. Is can we really understand the team and believe in the team's ability to execute? And what evidence can we gain that there are real customers out there willing to pay for this product or solution?
Cool. Thank you. And you guys have, we'll talk about resources at the end of this, where people can link up with you, but I know you have a lot of helpful resources on your site that can help some of our innovators go deeper before they go into a pitch. So I'm curious about the opportunities and the positioning for VentureSouth right now since the onset of the pandemic. How are investments forecasting for you so far? Have you learned anything? I just would love to gauge your thoughts and where you're at right now.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting couple of months as we waded into the crisis with our portfolio companies. We spent a lot of time in those first few weeks of the crisis really trying to triage the portfolio in the sense of understanding who was facing the biggest challenges, how were companies positioned from a cash runway standpoint, who do we need to help raise capital, where were the sort of raging fires that need to be put out. And fortunately for us, we've got about 50 active portfolio investments at this point. Most of our companies were in reasonably good shape. They had several months of cash runway in the bank. Some were in the process of raising funds, and I'm proud to report that VentureSouth has remained active in writing checks to support entrepreneurs through this period. And so that's been really great to see. Our investors have been willing to write checks and support entrepreneurs. And so for the most part, our portfolio is fairly healthy. Some of our companies are actually accelerating because they happen to be positioned in a part of the market that will accelerate the need for their servers, whether it's remote technology for remote teams, or something in the life sciences, or something in the hiring related to healthcare. Lots of different examples of companies that are actually accelerating through the crisis because they have a solution that the market needs, particularly at this time. We have other companies that, again, we've been able to help raise capital. We have a few that the crisis has put a damper on their sales and put them in a bind. And so again, we're working with some of those companies to help them raise capital and find ways to survive the next few months until things settle down. But overall, we've been, I think, inspired and encouraged by our portfolio company CEOs and their ability to face the challenge head on. We talk about the Stockdale paradox, which is another good to great reference. Well, it's broader than that, but that's where we point to for the lesson. Admiral Stockdale was a POW in Vietnam, and when interviewed about how he survived, he sort of made the comment that the optimists were the ones that died. So if you just think everything's going to work out fine in some short period of time, people tend to find when that doesn't happen, they lose hope and they give up. But the people that can sort of face the brutal facts about their current reality, but also not give up hope about the ultimate outcome, those tend to be the entrepreneurs in this case that do the best. They're tackling the real problem head on and making hard decisions quickly, but then also positioning their company to survive for the long term. And we've seen a lot of that from our entrepreneurs. So we've been really, really proud of that. And just kind of a reminder of why we do what we do. Entrepreneurs are pretty impressive people. They're finding solutions, on a daily basis to problems. And so it's great to be involved in supporting those kind of people and those kind of companies during a situation like this. And then, now we're back to focusing on new opportunities. Again, continuing to support the current portfolio, but fully open for business and back to operating as we were before in terms of taking in new opportunities and looking to support new entrepreneurs.
Awesome. And I'm glad that you mentioned the creativity and the optimism, as they can be tools, but it really is more of a long-term network. And we have mentors as part of that process. And that's why it takes experience, and failure is important. We talk about that all the time on Scribble. all of our innovators that we work with have talked about their failure stories. So I would love to just kind of wrap up with Venture Carolina. I just think it's fascinating that you guys have a nonprofit arm that and you're dabbling more in social innovation. So a lot of the things you talked about just now that do relate to these scalable companies can also relate to the community itself and how we tackle these hard issues as a society. So, why would a venture firm care about these areas, and where do you see that heading? And I'm even interested in the rural investments that you've made recently. So if you want to have some just final words on the community impact that you're trying to push forward and where you see that heading, I think that would be really inspiring for our listeners and readers.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Venture Carolina is our nonprofit sister organization that we launched a few years ago, because one of the things we observed about that flywheel process is that sometimes where it broke down was a knowledge problem on the part of either the entrepreneur or the investor around how this marketplace works. If you've never been an entrepreneur and raised capital before, or if you've been a successful business person but you've never invested in startups, just like a lot of other things you might do, there's a whole new set of terms and lingo and processes and understanding you have to learn in order to do this effectively. And so in order to reduce friction in that flywheel, one of the things that we felt like we needed to do was to provide some education to entrepreneurs and investors in our marketplace, where again, historically, most folks haven't been involved in this venture business. And so whether it's in Greenville or Charleston or Columbia or rural places outside of that, we've been able to put together some curriculum to help people understand how to think through the entire venture development process. From, again, the entrepreneurs learning how to pitch, to understanding how we go about our due diligence, to understanding what a term sheet looks like when we present one to an entrepreneur. What do all those crazy terms mean? How do we think about exit strategies? How do we think about boards? All those things are really important lessons if an entrepreneur is going to be successful and if an investor is going to have a successful investment. And so we felt like it was time for us to find a way to provide that education to the marketplace in a way that was a little more visible and separate from our investing activity, because we do think it's a vital function to effectively turn the flywheel faster and, again, reduce the friction in the flywheel across the state. And so the workshops we put together and the events that we do with some support from commerce grants and ARC grants and things like that have been really helpful for allowing us to be able to expand that program, educate as many entrepreneurs and investors as we can across the state, because again, the more of that activity we can facilitate, the better off we all are, whether it's our entrepreneurs or investors or the communities they're in, the jobs they create, the wealth they create, and how that gets recycled into our economy. So we want South Carolina to be a state that embraces that kind of activity and invites and attracts entrepreneurs that ultimately are going to create opportunities and spillover benefits for everybody in our state, not just those startups. And so it's an education-focused nonprofit with some other events and things we do to try to facilitate more capital formation and more understanding in the marketplace around how to think about funding and growing companies.
And you're sitting in your pitch studio, so I think that's really appropriate to bring up, because it's pretty cool that there is now a basically, and it's not free necessarily, but a space that you've allowed for practice and just in this process of someone learning what it means to even tell their story. I guess the pitch studio itself is nice to have a visible, example of why we need to gather and connect, and I'm sure we'll find ways to do that in this new COVID era as well. But but we really appreciate the time, and I know that you guys are so busy and so just invested yourself. And so we're going to go deeper on this. This will be coming out live in our funding newsletter, Noteworthy, for June. And people can find all of our content on scribblesc.com, and we'll make sure to link everything that you guys are doing in VentureSouth and Venture Carolina. There's so many tools that you guys have on your website that are accessible as well. So do you have any last words or anything else you would like our viewers and listeners to know about?
I think I would just wrap it up by saying we'd encourage those of you who are entrepreneurs out there to get in touch. If you're thinking about raising capital or want to participate in one of our workshops, we would certainly love to have you involved and love to hear from you. So reach out there. And again, we're also trying to build the capital base in South Carolina and beyond. So if you know anybody who might be interested in becoming an investor, the more capital and the more brains we get around the table as we run our investment process, the better off we all are. So we're always in the market for new investors to join us as well. So entrepreneurs and investors, please reach out. We would love to hear from you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Matt Dunbar. We will be seeing you again soon.
Thanks so much, Tia. Take care.
Have a good one.